31,000 feet over open water. Both engines gone silent. A full plane behind him, Captain Cameron Reed had 90 seconds to do something that the aircraft's own manual said was impossible. He did it anyway. He put a crippled airliner down safely with every single soul aboard alive, and for about 11 hours he was a hero. Until the airline that had sent him up in a broken plane realized that the only way to avoid ruin was to make the whole thing his fault. What they did to Cameron Reed to bury their crime, and the crash investigator who risked her career and eventually her life to dig up the truth, is a story that will make your stomach drop like the floor of that cabin. Stay with me all the way to the end, and subscribe right now, because the second emergency, the one that a corporation's greed made inevitable, the one that changed everything, is where this whole story turns, and you are not going to believe who was the only man on Earth who could stop it. Cameron Reed was born to fly, and he had to fight for every single inch of sky he ever earned. He grew up in the shadow of a small regional airport, the son of an aircraft mechanic, a meticulous, principled man who had spent 30 years keeping other people's planes safe, and who raised his son on a single unbreakable rule: an airplane will forgive almost anything except a lie. A plane doesn't care how you feel about it, his father used to say, wiping grease from his hands in the hangar where Cameron spent his childhood. It only cares whether you told the truth about it, whether that logbook says what's really wrong. You lie to an airplane, or somebody lies to you about one, and sooner or later it collects the debt. Always. Cameron grew up around aircraft the way other kids grow up around a family business, and by the time he was a teenager, he wanted only one thing in the world, which was to be in the cockpit rather than under the cowling. It was not an easy road for a kid like him. Aviation is an expensive, exclusive, overwhelmingly white world, and a black kid from a mechanic's family had to claw for every rating, every hour, every opportunity, in a field that quietly assumed the left seat belonged to someone else. Flight training costs a fortune, and Cameron had no fortune. He earned his hours the hardest ways. There are washing planes for flight time, instructing nervous students for a pittance flying cargo through weather that grounded everyone with better options, building his career. One grueling logged hour at a time. He got used to being the only one, the only black face in the training class in the crew room at the regional carrier's new hire orientation, and he got used to the flicker of surprise on a passenger's face when they saw who was walking up to the flight deck, the assumption quickly hidden that he must be someone else. He answered all of it the way the best of these men do, by being so good, so calm, so undeniably in command of the airplane that the assumptions had nowhere to stand. His father had told him it would be this way, and had told him how to answer it. You can't argue them out of what they think when they look at you. But an airplane doesn't care what color the hands on the yoke are. It only cares if those hands are good. Be so good the airplane vouches for you, and let them argue with the airplane. Cameron did exactly that for his whole career, and on the day both his engines died over the water, the airplane vouched for him, and 150 people lived because it did. But Cameron was extraordinary, a natural stick-and-rudder pilot with the kind of calm, precise judgment that cannot be taught. The pilot other pilots wanted flying the plane when things went wrong. He fought his way up through flight instructing and cargo runs and regional turboprops until he earned the 4 stripes of an airline captain, and he became quietly one of the finest pilots, flying a man whose hands stayed steady and whose mind stayed clear in exactly the situations that made other pilots freeze. He flew for a regional carrier called Sentinel Air, and Sentinel Air was run by a man named Dalton Cross. Dalton Cross was not a pilot and had never been one. He was a financier who had bought the airline as an asset to be squeezed, and he ran it the way a certain kind of executive runs a thing. He does not love by cutting every cost he could find, and the cost he cut most ruthlessly was maintenance. Aircraft maintenance is expensive, and it is also to a man like Cross invisible. A plane that hasn't crashed looks exactly like a plane that's been perfectly maintained right up until the moment it doesn't. Cross had built a culture at Sentinel Air of deferring repairs, of stretching inspection intervals, of pressuring mechanics to sign off on aircraft that should have been grounded, of treating the maintenance logbook not as a sacred record, but as a document to be managed. His mechanics, good people, many of them who had gone into the trade for the same reason. Cameron's father had, out of a love of keeping machines and the people in them safe, either went along or got pushed out, and the ones who went along did it with a sickness in their stomachs, signing their names to sign-offs. They didn't believe going home unable to look their families in the eye. Cross had built an entire company on the quiet moral injury of decent people doing things they knew were wrong because the alternative was losing their jobs. It is the way. These systems always work. Not a few villains, but one villain at the top and 100 trapped people beneath him, each one alone with a compromise. Each one certain there was nothing they could do, and the whole rotten arrangement had been profitable and so far lucky. Sentinel Air had not yet had a crash. It had only been getting closer to one deferral by deferral for years. The debt came due on Cameron Reed's airplane. It happened on a routine flight of full aircraft over open water at cruise altitude. There had been a known problem with that aircraft, a fuel system fault that had been written up deferred, written up again and never properly fixed because fixing it right would have grounded the plane and cost money Dalton Cross did not want to spend. And at 31,000 feet over the water with 150 people behind him. The fault finally fully manifested, fuel starvation to both engines, and then the sound. Every pilot dreads, and almost none ever hears the sound of both engines spooling down into silence. A powerless airliner, a dead stick in the old flying phrase, a plane become a glider with a limited number of miles of altitude to trade and no engines to change the math. He was not alone in that cockpit. His first officer was a young pilot named Priya Chandra, sharp and capable, but new. And in the silence, after the engines died, she froze for a heartbeat the way almost anyone would, and it was Cameron's voice, flat and calm and certain, that brought her back. "Priya, with me. Read me the glide numbers," giving her a task and anchor, a way to be useful instead of afraid. She would say later that his calm was the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed, that he sounded less like a man whose plane was falling and more like a man reading a checklist on a training flight, and that his steadiness had poured into her and into the whole flight deck until the fear had nowhere to live. Cameron had learned that from his father, in a way the mechanic's absolute refusal to be rushed into a mistake, and he had spent a career building it, the discipline that keeps a mind clear in the exact moments that scramble everyone else's. It was that as much as his hands that saved the airplane. What Cameron Reed did in the next 90 seconds is studied by pilots now. He did not panic. There was no time for panic and no room in him for it. He ran. The impossible calculations in his head. Glide ratio, distance, altitude, the nearest place a powerless jet could possibly reach, and he found the one solution. The situation allowed a solution. The manual didn't contain because the manual didn't imagine this, and he began the long, silent descent. There is a particular horror to a powerless jet. No roar of engines, only the eerie rush of wind over a machine that has become a glider. The cabin gone quiet as the passengers realize something is deeply wrong. The ground rising with terrible patience. Cameron had one shot and no go-around. A dead stick landing gives you a single approach because you have no power to climb away and try again. He managed the airplane's precious altitude like a miser, trading every foot for distance with perfect economy. Working the controls of a jet that no longer wanted to be a jet, threading it down toward the one piece of survivable ground his glide could reach. Priya called the altitudes and airspeeds in a voice she kept steady, because he had made her steady, the proximity of the water, the sink rate, the flare with no engines to cushion it. Every part of it was a thing. The manual said couldn't be done, and Cameron Reed did all of it and put a crippled, powerless airliner down safely. Dead stick, every engine silent, the airframe shuddering and holding with every single soul aboard alive. It was one of the greatest pieces of airmanship anyone in the industry had ever seen. Passengers wept and hugged strangers on the tarmac. Some of them would name their children after him. All of them would spend the rest of their lives knowing the exact number of seconds by which they had been spared. For a few hours, Cameron Reed was a national hero, the captain who had saved 150 lives with nothing but skill and nerve and the truth. And then Dalton Cross did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was brutal. Because if the truth came out, if it became known that the engines had failed due to a fuel system fault that Sentinel Air had deferred to save money, that the airline had knowingly sent a broken plane full of people into the sky, then Sentinel Air was finished. The fleet would be grounded, the maintenance fraud would be exposed, the liability would be catastrophic, and Dalton Cross would very likely go to prison. There was only one way out, and Cross took it without hesitation. The crime had to be nobody's fault but the pilot's. So, Sentinel Air, with all the resources of a company fighting for its life, turned on the man who had just saved its passengers. The falsification began immediately. The maintenance records for that aircraft were doctored, the history of the deferred fuel system fault scrubbed or rewritten, the logbook. The sacred logbook. Cameron's father had taught him never to lie to, turned into a lie that showed a perfectly maintained airplane. And with the paper trail, rewritten, the company's narrative wrote itself. The plane had been fine. The engines had failed for reasons unknown or better, yet because of something the pilot did. Cameron Reed had mishandled the aircraft, had caused or worsened the emergency through error, and his reckless dead-stick landing had needlessly endangered everyone aboard. It was a grotesque inversion, the man who had saved every life recast as the man who had endangered them. But Cross had the doctored records to support it, and a public that finds it easier to believe in one pilot's mistake than in a corporation's systematic crime. Cameron was grounded pending investigation. Sentinel Air, leaking its narrative to the press, painted him as a cowboy whose luck had run out. His certificate, his career, his identity, everything he'd clawed his way up to earn was suddenly in jeopardy, threatened by an inquiry that Cross's doctored records were designed to steer straight toward a finding of pilot error. And Cameron Reed, who had done the greatest thing of his life, who had told the truth to an airplane and been rewarded by it with 150 lives, found himself accused of the one thing his father had raised him never to be, the lie in the logbook. He knew what had really happened. He knew the fuel system fault had been deferred. But the records said otherwise now, and the records in aviation, as in everything, are what the world believes. The accusation did something to Cameron that the emergency itself never had. It frightened him deep down in a way that dead-sticking a jet had not. Because the thing they were accusing him of was the one thing his father had raised him to hold sacred. To be called the lie in the logbook, to have the world believe that Cameron Reed had endangered the very people he'd saved, was an assault on the deepest part of who he was. His father, old now and retired from the hangars, watched the news. Call his son a reckless cowboy, and said nothing for a long time, and then said only, "They doctored the book. I'd stake my life on it. A plane doesn't quit both engines clean like that unless somebody deferred something they shouldn't have." But knowing the truth and proving it against a corporation's doctored records were different things, and for a stretch of weeks, Cameron sank into something close to despair. Grounded, disgraced, watching everything he'd clawed his way up to earn slip away, half the industry believing he'd gotten lucky and half believing he'd gotten reckless, and the one thing he had, the truth, apparently worth nothing against a stack of falsified paper. He sat in his father's hangar one night among the tools and the smell of his childhood and wondered whether a man could fight a lie that big and win. His father handed him a rag the way he had when Cameron was a boy and said, "You told the truth to that airplane and it gave you back 150 lives. Now somebody's telling a lie about that airplane. You know what happens to lies about airplanes, son. They come due. You just have to still be standing when the bill arrives." Cameron stayed standing, and not long after, Dana Cole knocked on the hangar door. There was one person whose entire job was to find the truth, and she took that job seriously in a way Dalton Cross had not anticipated. Her name was Dana Cole. Dana was an air safety investigator, the person sent to determine the real cause of exactly this kind of event. She was 35, from a small town in the Pacific Northwest, an aerospace engineer by training who had joined the safety board because she believed with an almost religious intensity in the single principle that makes aviation the safest way to travel. That you find the truth about why an aircraft failed without blame and without cover-up, so that it never fails the same way again. Dana had spent her career learning that the most dangerous thing in aviation is not a mechanical fault. It is a lie about a mechanical fault, because a fault you understand can be fixed, and a fault you've covered up will kill again. She came to the Sentinel Air investigation at first with an open mind and the company's tidy narrative in front of her pilot error, a hero landing that maybe hadn't been as necessary as it looked, an airplane the record said was sound. And then Dana Cole did what she always did, which was to actually investigate, and the deeper she went, the less the story held together. The pattern of the engine failure did not look like anything a pilot could cause. It looked exactly like fuel starvation from a systemic fault. The doctored maintenance records were good, but they were not perfect. There were inconsistencies, a repair that appeared and disappeared, timestamps that didn't align, the ghost of a deferred fault that someone had tried to erase. And the physical evidence, when Dana examined the actual fuel system of the recovered aircraft, told a story flatly contradicting the paperwork. The fault was there in the metal, real and long-standing, exactly where a deferred repair should have been. Dana Cole sent to close a tidy case of pilot error. Instead, found herself staring at the outline of something far worse. An airline that had knowingly flown a broken plane, nearly killed 150 people, and then falsified federal maintenance records and framed the heroic pilot who saved them. And most chilling of all, a fleet full of other aircraft that might have the very same unrepaired fault still flying every day. She went to find Cameron Reed. She did not go to reassure him. She went to test him because she was a professional, and she trusted evidence, not sympathy. She interrogated him about every second of the flight, tried to catch the error the company claimed he'd made, tried to break his account, and instead found a pilot whose knowledge of what had happened was so precise, so honest, so consistent with the physical evidence and so inconsistent with the doctored records that it could not be anything but the truth. And at the end of it, Dana Cole said the thing that started the fight back. "Your engines didn't quit because of anything you did," she said. "They quit because of a fuel system fault this airline deferred to save money and then covered up by falsifying the maintenance records and then blamed on you. I can see it in the metal. The problem is that the metal and the paperwork disagree, and right now the world believes the paperwork." She looked at him, this engineer who believed in the truth about airplanes. "My whole job is to make sure a plane never fails the same way twice. This one is going to fail again on some other airplane with some other full load of people unless we prove what really happened. So I need your help, because the only person alive who knows exactly how that airplane died is the man they're blaming for killing it." Cameron Reed, who had been raised by a mechanic to believe that an airplane will forgive anything except a lie, looked at this investigator who had come to tell him that the lie was going to kill again unless they stopped it, and felt the thing his father had put in him, the reverence for the truth in the logbook, turned from grief into purpose. What followed was a dangerous, meticulous campaign to prove what a corporation had spent everything to bury, and it drew the pilot and the investigator together in the particular way that shared danger and a shared reverence for the truth. Two people who believe the same sacred thing, that you tell the truth about the machine, or the machine collects the debt, working side by side to drag that truth into the light before it killed again. The work drew them together in the long, tense nights that this kind of fight is made of. They pored over maintenance records and flight data in Dana's temporary office and in the hangar Cameron had grown up in, and slowly through the work they came to know each other. Cameron learned that Dana's fierce devotion to the truth came from a specific grief, that early in her career she had investigated a crash that killed dozens, a crash caused by a known fault that a company had hidden, and that she had never been able to forget the families in the hangar where the wreckage was laid out, or the knowledge that every one of those deaths had been preventable and predicted and buried. Dana learned that Cameron's calm hid a man who felt the weight of every life he was responsible for, who had gone into flying, not for the glamour, but because his father had taught him that keeping people safe in a machine was a sacred trust. One night, going over the flight data from his own emergency, Dana watched the trace of those 90 seconds, the engines dying, the impossible glide, the landing, and she went quiet. And then she said, "Do you understand how many people would be dead if it had been anyone else in that seat? I've read 100 of these. They almost never end the way yours did." And Cameron said, "I didn't do anything special. I just didn't lie to the airplane about what was happening, and I didn't let anybody else's panic in. That's all flying really is." Dana looked at him for a long moment, this pilot who called a miracle ordinary, and understood that she was falling for a kind of person she'd spent her whole career wishing existed and had almost stopped believing in. Neither of them said it, but the work changed after that, warmer and more dangerous both. They understood the shape of the problem. Cross had doctored the records, but doctoring is not erasing, and Dana knew that maintenance data lives in more places than one falsified logbook. There were the mechanics who had actually deferred the repair, some of them sick with guilt trapped in Cross's system. There were parts, records, work orders, the physical aircraft itself, the recovered flight data. And there was crucially the fleet, because if this fault was systemic, then other Sentinel aircraft carried it too, and their real maintenance histories cross-referenced would reveal the pattern Cross had tried to hide. Dana, with her authority as an investigator, and Cameron with his deep knowledge of the aircraft and the people who maintained them, began to reconstruct the true history. The deferred fault, the pressure to sign off the doctoring of the records after the incident. And they found their witness, a maintenance supervisor named Hector Diaz, a good man who had been forced to defer the repair against his own judgment and had been ordered to help doctor the records afterward, and who had been drinking himself sick over it ever since. A man who, when Cameron of all people came to him, not with anger, but with a way to finally tell the truth, broke down and agreed to help. But Dalton Cross was fighting for his freedom, and he fought accordingly. When he realized that his tidy pilot error narrative was unraveling, that the investigator was digging where she shouldn't, and the pilot wouldn't disappear quietly, he turned the full force of a desperate corporation on both of them. Pressure came down on Dana through channels questioning her objectivity, suggesting she'd been compromised by sympathy for the pilot trying to get her removed from the investigation. Cameron was hit with fresh accusations. And then, it turned dangerous. Hector Diaz. The witness was threatened into silence and very nearly vanished, and Dana, driving home one night, was run off the road by a vehicle that didn't stop a warning, that made unmistakably clear that Cross was now willing to see the truth die with the people carrying it. It was the moment Cameron tried to call it off to protect Dana, and it was Dana who refused, in the words that defined her. "I have stood in the wreckage of airplanes that fell out of the sky because somebody decided the truth was too expensive," she said. "I have carried what was left of people who died so a man like Cross could save money and save face. I'm not going to be scared off this one because I know something you don't want to think about, Cameron. That fault is still out there on other airplanes flying right now, and the only reason 150 more people aren't already dead is luck, and luck runs out." And in the saying of it, the thing that had been building between them across all those dangerous nights came into the open, and Cameron understood that he was not alone in the cockpit of this fight anymore. And then the second emergency came, and it changed everything, because Dana was right that luck runs out. Here's the part that haunted Cameron and Dana for the rest of their lives. They saw it coming, and they could not stop it. As their investigation revealed that the fault was systemic, that other Sentinel aircraft almost certainly carried the same unrepaired defect, Dana had filed urgent warnings, pushed for an emergency grounding of the fleet, argued to anyone who would listen that another plane was going to fall out of the sky. But an emergency grounding is a slow, contested thing, and Dalton Cross fought it with everything he had, because grounding meant admitting the fault, and admitting the fault meant ruin. He deployed lawyers, disputed the findings, questioned. Dana's objectivity ran out the clock, and the fleet kept flying while the paperwork crawled. Cameron and Dana spent those days in a state of helpless dread, knowing what was almost certainly out there in the sky, unable to make the system move fast enough, watching departure boards full of Sentinel flights and doing the math on how long luck could hold. It could not hold forever. Dalton Cross, even as the investigation closed in, had kept his fleet flying because grounding it meant admitting the fault, and admitting the fault meant ruin. And so the very disaster they had been screaming about came to pass. Another full airplane, another crew, the same silent engines. The same deferred fuel system fault that had nearly killed Cameron's passengers was still out there unrepaired on other Sentinel aircraft. And one day, of course, it was one day, the debt always comes due. It manifested again on another flight, another full airplane, another crew who had never dead-sticked anything in their lives. Both engines began to starve at altitude exactly as they had on Cameron's flight, and the crew of that airplane found themselves living the nightmare that Cross's cover-up had guaranteed would happen again. Cameron Reed was on the ground, grounded, disgraced, and he was the one person alive who had already flown this exact impossible emergency and lived. When word of the unfolding crisis reached him through Dana, through the frantic scramble as the airline and the controllers realized what was happening, Cameron did the only thing a man raised the way he'd been raised could do. He got himself to where he could help, and it was not easy. He was grounded, disgraced, officially nobody, and there were people in that chain who did not want the reckless cowboy anywhere near a live emergency. It was Dana who cut through it, who used her authority and her certainty to get Cameron patched through because she knew, she of all people knew, that the one man alive who had flown this exact death and lived was the only chance that airplane had. And so Cameron's voice went into the headsets of a terrified crew 1,000 miles away, and he talked them through it from the ground, the way one pilot who has been there talks another through the unsurvivable. He could hear the fear in the captain's voice, the same fear Priya had felt, and he did for that stranger what he'd done for her. He gave him tasks, anchors, certainty. "You've got more airplane than you think," Cameron told him, calm as still water. "I know because I've flown this one. Listen to me, and I'll bring you down. Read me your altitude." He gave them the solution he'd found in his own 90 seconds over the water, the glide, the numbers, the impossible landing. The manual didn't contain his voice, calm and certain in their headsets, and he flew that airplane by proxy through the hands of a crew who trusted the disgraced captain because he was the only man alive who knew the way down. For 9 minutes, the longest 9 minutes anyone in that operations room would ever live through, Cameron Reed flew an airplane he could not see 1,000 miles away through another pilot's hands. He gave them the glide speed that wrung the most distance from the least altitude. He talked them past the moment of panic when the terrain didn't look reachable, the exact moment his own instinct had screamed on his own flight, and told them to trust the numbers over the fear. I walked them through the flare, the thing that had no procedure, the thing you could only know if you'd done it. And when the captain's voice came back over the frequency, shaking, disbelieving, alive, to say they were down, they were stopped, everyone was okay. The operations room erupted, and Cameron Reed set down the headset with his hands trembling for the first time in the whole ordeal, because he had just done the impossible thing twice, once with his own hands, and once with his voice. Another full airplane, another dead stick brought down safely every soul alive, because the pilot the company had blamed for the first miracle refused to let a second crew die for the same lie. And in that instant, the entire lie collapsed. Because the same impossible failure had just happened again on a different aircraft with a different crew, which meant it could not possibly have been Cameron Reed's error. It was the fleet. It was the fault. It was exactly what Cameron had said, and exactly what the doctored records denied, proven not by an argument but by a second airplane full of people nearly dying the identical death. The truth was now written across the sky in a way no falsified logbook could survive. You cannot doctor two airplanes. You cannot call it pilot error when two different crews on two different aircraft on two different days suffer the identical, impossible failure. The only thing the two flights had in common was the airline, the aircraft type, and the fault that Airline had refused to fix. The second dead stick did in one afternoon what months of investigation had been fighting to do. It made the truth undeniable, and it did it in front of the whole world. Everything broke open after that. Dana Cole's investigation, now impossible to suppress, laid it all out. The deferred fuel system fault, the pattern across the fleet, the physical evidence in the metal and with Hector Diaz's testimony, and the reconstructed records, the deliberate falsification of federal maintenance documents, and the framing of Cameron Reed. The second emergency was the keystone that made all of it undeniable. Dalton Cross's fleet was grounded at last. Every aircraft inspected the systemic fault found on plane after plane, confirming that his cost-cutting had turned an entire airline into a fleet of near disasters waiting to happen. The fall of Dalton Cross was total, and it was the kind of fall a man earns by gambling with other people's lives. Falsifying maintenance records is a federal crime. Knowingly operating unairworthy aircraft and endangering the traveling public is a graver one. And framing the pilot who'd saved 150 lives was the kind of moral obscenity that once exposed Left Cross with not a single defender. He was prosecuted, his airline seized and shut down the maintenance fraud scheme, unwound the executives and complicit managers who had enforced his culture of deferral, swept up alongside him. The investigators who tore through Sentinel's records found what they always find in these cases, once they finally look, not a single mistake, but a pattern. Years of it. Deferrals stacked on deferrals. Inspections rushed mechanics, overruled a whole airline run on the gamble that the debt would come due on someone else's watch. Every grounded aircraft that was found to carry the same unrepaired fault was one more count against him, one more airplane full of people who would have died if the truth had stayed buried a little longer. The man who had treated an airplane's logbook as a document to be managed and 150 lives as an acceptable risk. Learned at last the thing Cameron's father had known all along, that you can lie to an airplane for a while, but sooner or later it collects the debt, and it collects it from you. Cameron Reed was completely exonerated. His certificate restored his record, cleared the reckless cowboy narrative exposed as the corporate lie it was, and his dead-stick landing recognized officially and permanently as one of the greatest feats of airmanship in aviation history, performed by a pilot who had saved every life aboard a plane his own airline had sabotaged. He returned to flying, but he did more than fly. He became a leading voice for aviation safety, working to make sure the pressures that had turned Sentinel Air into a flying coffin could never take hold again, testifying, teaching, carrying his father's rule. You tell the truth about the machine, or it collects the debt into the systems that keep millions of people safe in the sky. The 2 crews he had saved, and their hundreds of passengers, were living proof of what one honest pilot's skill and refusal to lie could hold up against a corporation's greed. Priya Chandra, his first officer from the first flight, had stood by him publicly through the whole ordeal, even when it was costly to do so, and she went on to a distinguished career, always saying that she had learned everything that mattered about flying in 90 silent seconds over the water, watching Cameron Reed refuse to panic. Hector Diaz, the mechanic who had been forced to defer the repair and doctor the records and who had found the courage to tell the truth, was not celebrated the way the pilots were. But Cameron made sure his role was known, made sure everyone understood that the cover-up had been broken, not just by a hero pilot, but by an ordinary mechanic who decided he could not carry the lie one more day. And the second crew, the strangers. Cameron had talked down through his own voice, came to find him, all of them, and there is no way to describe what passes between people who have been through that and the man who brought them through it. Cameron's father, the old mechanic, lived to see his son fully vindicated, and to hear the industry that had called his boy a cowboy officially recognize the dead-stick landing as one of the greatest feats of airmanship on record. "An airplane will forgive anything except a lie," the old man said, watching the ceremony. "Took a while. But it forgave you, and it collected from him, just like I always told you." And Cameron and Dana, they had come together over the wreckage of a lie, the pilot and the investigator. 2 people who believed the same sacred thing about telling the truth and had risked their careers and their lives to prove it. It had grown in the long, dangerous work, in the shared reverence for the truth, in the metal, in the way each had refused to let the other be run off the road, literally and otherwise. It was Cameron who said it first, which surprised them both because he was the calm one. He said it after it was all over, standing on the tarmac at dusk near a hangar, not unlike the one he'd grown up in, watching a plane climb out into a safe sky. "My father told me an airplane will forgive anything except a lie," he said. "He never told me what to do when the lie is about you, when the whole world's got the doctored logbook and you're the only one who knows the truth. Turns out the answer is, you find the one person whose whole life is refusing to accept the doctored logbook." He looked at her. "You didn't just save my career, Dana. You saved a plane full of strangers who'll never know your name, because you wouldn't let a lie stand. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever watched a person do. I fell in love with you somewhere in the middle of it, and I've been trying to find the nerve to land this particular approach ever since." Dana, who dealt in evidence and root causes, told him that her analysis of the situation had reached the same conclusion some time ago. "I've spent my whole career arriving after the crash," she said. "Reading the black box, standing in the wreckage, telling families why. You're the first thing I ever got to reach in time, the first crash I got to prevent instead of investigate." She took his hand. "I fell in love with you the night they ran me off the road, and my first clear thought before the fear was that I couldn't leave you to fight this alone. I've been holding at the outer marker ever since, waiting for you to clear me to land." Cameron said he'd never been more certain of an approach in his life, and that they should probably stop talking like pilots now. And Dana said, not a chance, that it was the only language either of them was any good at, and kissed him on the tarmac in the last of the light. They were married within the year in a hangar. Cameron insisted, said no ballroom would do, said he wanted to be married in the kind of place that had raised him, where the truth about machines got told and lives got saved. They cleared a corner of the hangar and strung lights from the rafters where work lamps usually hung, and a small aircraft sat parked behind the altar like a witness. Priya was there in her airline uniform, and Hector Diaz, and word came from both of the crews Cameron had saved. Cameron's father, the old mechanic, was there, and when he shook Dana's hand, he held it a beat too long and said in the gruff shorthand of men who work with their hands, "You believed the metal over the paperwork. When the whole world was reading the doctored book and calling my boy a liar, you went and put your hands on the actual airplane and let it tell you the truth. That's the whole job right there. You'd have made a hell of a mechanic." From that man, it was the highest praise there was, and Dana understood it and had to look away for a moment to keep her composure. When it came time for the vows, Cameron told Dana that he had spent his whole life trusting machines and not quite trusting people, and that she was the first person he'd ever trusted, the way he trusted a well-kept airplane completely with his life, and that he could not think of anything truer to say than that. Hector Diaz was there too, the witness who had found his courage sober now and steady, and the two crews Cameron had saved sent word, and somewhere in the sky above them, always planes climbed out safely into the dark, carrying people who would never know how close they'd come, or who had refused to let the debt fall on them. Some men treat the truth as a cost, a line item, a thing to be managed and deferred, and when necessary erased the maintenance log, doctored the fault, ignored the hero, blamed all of it, acceptable as long as the numbers work and the plane hasn't fallen out of the sky yet. Dalton Cross believed that, and it made him money, and in the end it destroyed him, because there is one thing that cannot be permanently managed, and that is the truth about a machine that people's lives depend on. Cameron Reed was raised to tell that truth and to trust it, and when a corporation buried it and blamed him, an investigator who believed in it as fiercely as he did dug it back up, and then a second airplane full of people nearly died, exactly as the lie said was impossible, and wrote the truth across the sky, and the debt came due at last on the man who'd been deferring it all along. If this story got your stomach in your throat, do Cameron a favor, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me what you would have done with both engines, silent and 90 seconds to the water, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who bury the truth to save money are only safe until the machine collects the debt, and it always, always collects. We've got more of these coming, good people. The powerful tried to destroy each with a villain who was certain he could bury the truth and let someone else pay for it, and each with the exact moment it all comes roaring back around on him, and you will not want to miss a single one of them. Tell me in the comments what you would have done with both engines silent and the water coming up, and I'll see you in the very next story.